Good evening, and welcome to Edward's Sleep Mysteries. I'm Edward, speaking softly to you as the day finally releases you. Halimos is not an achievement, it's a gentle surrender. If you like, you can tell me in the comments whether you hear the final line or fall asleep somewhere in between. You're warmly invited to subscribe if these stories accompany your nights. Now, settle back and let the mystery carry you into dreams. Chapter 1. A Night Set Aside for Cheer. There are towns in England, gentle reader, whose very names seem to whisper of hedgerows and modest contentment, of church bells heard across damp fields and kettles singing upon cheerful hearths. Hedgemore was precisely such a town, though whether it deserved its air of quiet certainty is a matter we shall presently examine with that patience which all truthful narratives require. It was not a large town, nor did it harbour grand ambitions. Its high street ran the length perhaps of a gentleman's leisurely afternoon walk, and its shops displayed their wares with that understated confidence which suggests that custom is assured and ostentation unnecessary. The baker knew his flour as intimately as a scholar knows his Latin. The chemist measured his powders with a precision that would have satisfied the most exacting of physicians, and the postmistress, Mrs. Dulcie Vine, could recall with perfect accuracy which household subscribed to which periodical, though she would never, of course, admit to reading so much as a word of any correspondence not addressed to herself. Christmas arrived in Hedgemore as it had done for generations, gradually, predictably, and with a quiet insistence that rendered resistance not merely futile but faintly improper. By the first week of December, the lamplighter found his work commencing a full 2 hours earlier than in summer, and took satisfaction in the golden squares of light that appeared in parlour windows as dusk descended. The greengrocer arranged holly branches with the same deliberate care each year, as though nature herself might take offence were they displayed with insufficient reverence. Even the weather, it seemed, had been thoroughly informed of its obligations, and provided a frost so delicate and regular that one might have thought it applied by municipal decree. In such a setting, it is hardly surprising that certain individuals should have acquired, by degrees, a prominence which seemed less earned than inherited by virtue of their willingness to occupy it. Among these we must particularly note 3 personages whose words and actions shall form the substance of our tale, though none of them, I venture to say, would have suspected at Christmas time that their names should be so closely examined, nor their conduct so carefully weighed in the balance of memory. The first of these was Mr. Leonard Price, assistant to the town archivist, a position which sounds rather grander than it was, consisting as it did chiefly of ensuring that parish records were stored with proper attention to chronology, and that visitors to the archive room did not inadvertently carry away any documents of civic importance tucked absent-mindedly beneath their arms. Mr. Praguillo was perhaps 35 years of age, though his manner suggested a temperament considerably older. He possessed that rare quality of being genuinely helpful without making a performance of it, which meant that his kindnesses were often accepted without particular notice, much as one might accept the reliable ticking of a well-made clock. He lived in modest lodgings above a stationer's shop on Mill Street, kept his own counsel with admirable consistency, and was known to walk each morning to his place of employment with such punctuality that the town's more imaginative residents might have set their watches by his appearance. His features were unremarkable, neither handsome nor otherwise. His face seemed designed for the express purpose of not drawing attention. His coat was respectable, his hat properly brushed, and his boots maintained with sufficient care to avoid censure without inviting comment. In short, Mr. Leonard Price was exactly the sort of man whom society required in considerable numbers, but seldom paused to acknowledge. Our second personage demands rather more description, for Mrs. Agnes Harrow was a woman whose presence commanded immediate recognition, though whether this was achieved through force of character or merely through force of habit was a question the town had long since ceased to consider. She was the widow of the late Mr. George Harrow, who had served as churchwarden with such dedication that his memorial plaque, positioned prominently near the baptismal font, rather gave the impression that he continued to discharge his duties from beyond the veil. Mrs. Harrow resided in Ashdown House, a dwelling whose name suggested greater magnificence than its structure could properly support, though it was certainly larger than most in Hedgemore. She had inherited, along with the house, a sense of civic obligation which she discharged with admirable regularity, hosting gatherings that the town had come to regard not as invitations, but as appointments in the social calendar. Her Christmas evening reception was foremost among these occasions, anticipated with a mixture of genuine pleasure and that peculiar anxiety which attends any event where one's attendance might be noted and one's absence most certainly remarked upon. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, though she maintained her appearance with sufficient care that speculation on the matter was generally confined to the most intimate of tea circles. Her dress suggested prosperity without extravagance, her manner combined graciousness with an underlying firmness, and her opinions, once expressed, possessed that quality of seeming less like personal views than statements of established fact. If there was a matter of importance in Hedgemore, Mrs. Harrow knew of it. If there was a difficulty requiring resolution, she generally proposed the solution, and if there was credit to be distributed for any civic improvement, her name appeared prominently in its allocation. Our third principal figure was Reverend Paul Merton, whose appointment to St. Stephen's Church some 12 years earlier had been greeted with that cautious approval which English parishes extend to their clergy, neither effusive enough to suggest enthusiasm, nor reserved enough to imply doubt. He was a man well suited to his calling in the manner that a glove is well suited to a hand, comfortable, serviceable, and unlikely to attract particular notice unless removed. Reverend Merton's sermons were mercifully brief, theologically sound without being troublingly complex, and delivered in a voice that carried to the rear pews without suggesting that he particularly wished to reach them. He believed firmly in the virtue of peace, the wisdom of compromise, and the general principle that matters were best left as they were, unless absolutely compelling circumstances demanded otherwise. This philosophy served him admirably in his pastoral duties, as it meant he was unlikely to disturb his congregation with uncomfortable questions, nor trouble the established order with inconvenient truths. He was perhaps 40 years of age, possessed of a round, amiable face that suggested perpetual mild surprise, and maintained lodgings in the rectory with his sister, Miss Henrietta Merton, who kept house with such efficiency that the Reverend's domestic arrangements were never once the subject of parish gossip, which in Hedgemore represented the highest possible commendation. As Christmas approached, these three individuals moved through their accustomed routines with that comfortable certainty which suggests that all necessary matters have long been settled, and that the future holds no surprises sufficiently important to merit present concern. Mr. Price catalogued documents and assisted visitors to the archive with his customary quiet competence. Mrs. Harrow issued invitations and made arrangements for her annual gathering, with the precision of a military commander preparing for a campaign of exceptional importance. Reverend Merton composed his Christmas sermon, settling after some deliberation upon the theme of peace and goodwill, which had served admirably in previous years and showed no signs of requiring revision. The town itself prepared for the season, with its usual mixture of genuine sentiment and social obligation. Shop windows displayed their finest goods, carolers practised their harmonies in the church hall, and Mrs. Vine at the post office found herself managing an increased volume of correspondence, including, she noted with satisfaction, several parcels addressed to Ashdown House, which confirmed that Mrs. Harrow's preparations were proceeding according to schedule. It was, in short, exactly the sort of Christmas that Hedgemore had always known, familiar, comfortable, and reassuring in its predictability. That this particular Christmas should prove memorable for reasons entirely unexpected, and that its events should cast a long shadow over subsequent years, was something no person in that cheerful lamp-lit town could possibly have anticipated as December progressed toward its appointed climax. For there are some evenings, dear reader, which arrive wearing the costume of ordinary occasions, yet carry within them the seeds of questions that refuse to be buried, and truths that insist with quiet persistence upon eventually being acknowledged. Mrs. Harrow's Christmas gathering was to be precisely such an evening, though not a soul in Hedgemore suspected it as the invitations were received, the preparations completed, and the appointed hour drew near, with that inevitability which characterises all significant moments in human affairs, whether we recognise their significance or not. Chapter 2. The Moment That Passed Too Quietly. The evening of Mrs. Harrow's Christmas gathering arrived with that punctuality which well-established social occasions seem to possess, as though the very calendar itself had been consulted in advance and had given its solemn consent. By 6 o'clock, Ashdown House presented a picture of such welcoming warmth that even the most reluctant guest might have felt obliged to approach its lighted doorway with something approaching genuine enthusiasm. Candles had been positioned in every window with mathematical precision, their flames steady behind glass that had been polished to a state of almost miraculous transparency. The front door, adorned with a wreath of such generous proportions that it must surely have required the sacrifice of several holly bushes, stood open despite the December chill, revealing a hallway where lamplight gleamed upon surfaces that appeared to have been maintained in perpetual readiness for exactly this moment. Yes, Harrow herself, resplendent in a gown of deep burgundy that suggested both festivity and authority, received her guests with that mixture of graciousness and vigilance which characterises those who view hospitality as a form of civic administration. The guests arrived in that careful sequence which unspoken social understanding had long since established. First came those whose punctuality was guaranteed by anxiety, the younger couples, not yet sufficiently established to risk the appearance of presumption, the widowed ladies whose attendance was expected, but whose presence was never quite taken for granted, and the various tradespeople whose prosperity depended upon maintaining cordial relations with their betters. These were followed, at intervals calculated to suggest neither excessive eagerness nor deliberate tardiness, by the more prominent citizens. Mr. Gill also and Gilbert Rowe, whose warehouses supplied much of the surrounding district, Miss Clara Fenwick, whose late father's medical practice had left her both comfortably situated and socially respected, and several others whose names, while familiar to Hedgemore, need not detain us except as they form part of that general assembly whose collective presence transforms a private entertainment into a public occasion. Reverend Merton arrived at precisely 6:15, having calculated that this represented neither unseemly haste nor offensive delay. He was accompanied by his sister, Miss Henrietta, whose dress of subdued grey suggested that she understood perfectly the delicate balance between participating in festivities and maintaining that reserve appropriate to a clergyman's household. Mr. Paul Price appeared some minutes later, slipping into the gathering with such practised unobtrusiveness that several guests who later claimed to have conversed with him throughout the evening could not, when pressed, recall the exact moment of his arrival. The drawing-room at Ashdown House, though not large by the standards of truly grand establishments, possessed dimensions sufficient to accommodate perhaps 30 persons without requiring them to stand in one another's immediate vicinity. Mrs. Harrow had arranged the furniture with careful attention to the promotion of conversation. Small clusters of chairs suggested intimacy without encouraging prolonged private discussion, while the positioning of various tables created natural points of circulation where guests might pause, refresh themselves, and observe the general company without appearing to do so deliberately. A fire burned with such consistent warmth that one might have suspected it of having been instructed in its duties some hours previously. Upon the mantelpiece, evergreen branches had been arranged with that artful casualness which requires considerable planning to achieve. The walls, papered in a pattern of modest elegance, provided a background against which the assembled company appeared to considerable advantage, their faces reflecting that particular glow which results from the combination of firelight, moderate refreshment, and the satisfaction of having fulfilled a social obligation. The conversation proceeded along those comfortable channels which such gatherings inevitably establish. Weather received its customary attention, with general agreement that the frost, while severe, was at least consistent, and that snow, should it arrive, would be welcome provided it did not impede travel or damage property. Recent events in the parish were reviewed with appropriate interest. The organ required repair, though not urgently. The charity's subscriptions had exceeded expectations, which reflected well upon the generosity of all present, and the appointment of a new schoolmaster appeared likely to proceed without controversy, assuming certain formalities were observed. Mrs. Harrow moved among her guests with the practised ease of one who understands that successful hospitality requires constant vigilance, disguised as effortless charm. She ensured that no person stood alone for longer than propriety permitted, that conversations flowed without becoming either too animated or too subdued, and that refreshment circulated with sufficient frequency to prevent complaint without encouraging excess. Mr. Price, observed by those few who troubled to observe him, performed numerous small services, retrieving a dropped glove, adjusting a chair that had been positioned too close to the fire, ensuring that elderly Mrs. Pemberton's teacup was replenished before she was obliged to request it. It was perhaps 7:30 when the moment occurred, though its exact timing would be disputed by those who later attempted to reconstruct the evening's sequence. The conversation had reached one of those natural pauses which sometimes descend upon gatherings, not from any awkwardness, but simply from the temporary exhaustion of immediately available topics. Into this pause Miss Clara Fenwick, who had been standing near the window in conversation with Mr. Rowe, spoke with that clarity which sometimes accompanies remarks made without particular forethought. "I wonder," said she, in a tone that suggested mild curiosity rather than deliberate provocation, "whether anyone has heard news of the Ashworth family. It must be nearly 15 years since they left Hedgemore, yet I find myself thinking of them at Christmas time." The effect of these words upon the assembled company was both immediate and peculiar. Several guests, who had been engaged in their own conversations, fell abruptly silent. Mrs. Harrow, who had been directing a servant toward a table that required clearing, became suddenly motionless. Reverend Merton, in the act of raising his teacup, paused with the vessel suspended midway to his lips, as though uncertain whether to complete the gesture or abandon it entirely. The silence that followed Miss Fenwick's remark lasted perhaps 3 seconds, though to those who experienced it the interval seemed considerably longer. It was a silence not of mere quietness but of active suppression, as though the entire room had simultaneously drawn breath and forgotten to release it. It was Mr. Price who moved first. With a motion so gentle as to be almost imperceptible, he stepped forward and adjusted a candlestick that had been standing perfectly upright upon a side table. This trivial action, requiring neither explanation nor acknowledgement, somehow released the room from its momentary paralysis. Mrs. Harrow completed her instruction to the servant. Reverend Merton completed his sip of tea. Conversation resumed among those who had been speaking, though with slightly increased volume, as though to fill the space that had briefly opened. "I believe," said Mrs. Harrow in a voice that carried across the room with perfect composure, "that the Ashworths settled somewhere in the North Country. Yorkshire, was it not? They wrote, I recall, expressing satisfaction with their new situation. One hopes they have prospered." She smiled with that particular warmth which suggests that a topic has been thoroughly addressed and may now be considered closed. "But come, we must not allow melancholy thoughts to intrude upon our festivities. Mr. Rowe, you were telling me earlier of your plans for the new warehouse. Pray continue, for I am certain the company would benefit from understanding how our local commerce advances." Mr. Rowe, who had made no such previous disclosure, possessed sufficient social acuity to recognise an offered rescue when it appeared. He launched into an account of business prospects with an enthusiasm that seemed slightly excessive even by the standards of a man discussing his own enterprises. Other conversations resumed with similar energy, as though the entire company had wordlessly agreed that heightened animation represented the appropriate response to what had just occurred. Yet something had shifted. Those guests sensitive to atmospheric changes would have noticed, had they been paying particular attention, that certain persons avoided catching one another's eyes, that Miss Fenwick found herself briefly isolated before Mrs. Harrow, with studied casualness, drew her into a conversation about music, They might have observed that Reverend Merton's subsequent contributions to conversation possessed a forced quality, as though he were performing the role of genial guest, rather than inhabiting it naturally. Mr. Price remained quietly present throughout, refilling glasses, moving chairs, and performing those countless small services that mark a considerate guest. Yet there was something in his stillness, in the care with which he avoided appearing to observe, that suggested a deeper attention than his modest activity implied. He had heard what was said, he had witnessed what was not said, and he understood, with the clarity that comes from long experience of witnessing what others prefer to forget, that a name, once spoken into deliberate silence, creates ripples that cannot be immediately stilled. The evening proceeded to its appointed conclusion. Guests departed with expressions of gratitude and satisfaction. Mrs. Harrow accepted their thanks with that gracious fatigue which successful hostesses display to indicate that their exertions, while considerable, have been willingly undertaken. By 10 o'clock, Ashdown House stood empty save for servants clearing the remnants of hospitality, and the street outside returned to that winter quietness which Christmas Eve traditionally bestows upon English towns. Yet in the days that followed, those few who had truly heard what had been said that evening would discover that silence, once broken, possesses a peculiar persistence. Questions, once raised, do not readily consent to be forgotten, and memories, no matter how carefully buried, have a troubling tendency to surface at precisely those moments when their appearance is least desired and most difficult to ignore. The Christmas evening at Ashdown House had passed, as Mrs. Harrow would later insist, without incident worthy of particular mention. And it was precisely this insistence, repeated with such careful consistency, that confirmed to those who understood such things that something significant had indeed occurred, something that the town had immediately and unanimously agreed not to recall. Chapter 3. A Silence Shared Without Agreement. The morning following Mrs. Harrow's gathering dawned with that crystalline clarity which December occasionally bestows upon the English countryside, as though nature herself wished to demonstrate that winter need not always be synonymous with gloom. Frost had painted intricate patterns upon every window in Hedgemore, and the church bells rang across air so still that their sound seemed to hang suspended between earth and sky, reluctant to disperse into the vastness beyond. It was Boxing Day, that peculiar English institution which follows Christmas with dutiful regularity, bringing with it a lessening of formality and an increase in social circulation. Servants received their boxes, tradespeople their customary gratuities, and the general populace found itself at liberty to call upon neighbours with that easy informality which the season both permitted and encouraged. Under ordinary circumstances, such a day would have seen considerable discussion of the previous evening's entertainment, with opinions exchanged, observations compared, and the success of Mrs. Harrow's arrangements confirmed through collective agreement. Yet on this particular Boxing Day, something curious occurred in the conversational landscape of Hedgemore. The gathering at Ashdown House was mentioned, certainly, but in terms so carefully neutral as to suggest that each speaker had independently arrived at the conclusion that detailed commentary would be imprudent. Mrs. Harrow's arrangements were praised in the most general terms. The refreshments were declared adequate, the company agreeable, and the evening altogether satisfactory, these judgments delivered with such studied moderation that they might have been prepared in advance and distributed among the populace for uniform repetition. Mr. Leonard Price, whose habits included a morning walk that took him past the post office and along the High Street before arriving at the town archive, found himself the inadvertent witness to several such exchanges. Outside the baker's establishment, he observed Mrs. Pemberton speaking with Mrs. Vine, their heads inclined toward one another in that attitude which suggests confidential discourse. Yet as he approached, their conversation shifted with such abruptness that he distinctly heard Mrs. Vine remark upon the excellence of the morning frost, a topic which seemed unlikely to have generated the intensity of engagement he had witnessed from a distance. At the greengrocer's, Mr. Thompson was arranging his remaining stock of winter vegetables With unusual concentration, his attention fixed upon a row of turnips as though they presented problems of exceptional complexity. When Price bid him good morning and ventured to inquire whether he had attended the previous evening's gathering, Thompson's response was remarkable for its brevity. "Aye, I was there," said he, and immediately found it necessary to retreat into his shop to attend to a customer who had not, so far as Price could determine, actually entered the premises. The archive itself, which Price reached at his customary hour, offered further evidence of this peculiar atmospheric disturbance. Miss Sarah Pritchard, who assisted in the reading room on certain mornings, arrived some quarter hour after her usual time, appearing flustered in a manner most unlike her typical composure. She had attended Mrs. Harrow's gathering, Price knew, for he had observed her there in conversation with Reverend Merton's sister. Yet when he inquired, with genuine courtesy, whether she had enjoyed the evening, her response suggested that the question had caught her quite unprepared. "Oh, yes, most pleasant indeed," she said, with an emphasis that seemed to protest rather more than the inquiry warranted. "Mrs. Harrow is always such an accomplished hostess. The arrangements were, that is to say, everything was exactly as one might expect. I cannot imagine that anyone could find cause for complaint." Having delivered this assessment, she busied herself with the arrangement of certain periodicals that were already in perfect order, and did not raise her eyes toward Price again for the better part of an hour. Price settled himself at his usual desk and attended to his regular duties with that methodical care which characterized his approach to all responsibilities. Yet his mind, while his hand sorted documents and verified references, turned over the curious events of the previous evening with the thoroughness of a scholar examining a text in which something significant appears to be concealed between the lines. The name that had been spoken, Ashworth, resonated in his memory with particular clarity. He recalled with the precision that constant attention to detail had cultivated a family by that name who had indeed resided in Hedgemore some years previously. The father, if memory served, had been engaged in some manner of trade, though the exact nature of his business escaped immediate recollection. There had been a wife certainly, and children, though their number and age remained vague in his mind. They had occupied a house on the eastern edge of town, a modest dwelling that now served as lodgings for the assistant schoolmaster. Their departure had occurred in winter. Price remembered that distinctly, for he had been cataloguing parish records at the time, and had noted the family's removal from the register of residence. Yet beyond these bare facts, his recollection offered little substance. They had been neither prominent enough to command universal notice, nor so obscure as to pass entirely unobserved. They had existed, and then they had ceased to exist within the boundaries of Hedgemore's daily life, and the town had continued its routines without apparent disruption. What struck Price as he reflected upon the matter was not the fact of their departure, but rather the peculiar quality of the town's response to their being mentioned. It was not the response of collective ignorance, of people struggling to recall distant acquaintances, nor was it the response of simple indifference, of a community unmoved by the fate of former neighbours. It was something altogether different, the response of persons who remembered perfectly well, but had agreed, through some unspoken consensus, that certain memories were best left undisturbed. Throughout the day, as Price went about his work, fragments of overheard conversation reached his ears, each adding to the pattern he had begun to perceive. At midday, when he stepped out briefly to take refreshment at the nearby tea-room, he heard two women at an adjacent table discussing Christmas arrangements for the coming year. One suggested, with apparent innocence, that perhaps a collection might be organised for families in difficult circumstances. The other, after a pause so slight that a less attentive listener might have missed it, entirely responded that such matters were best left to those with proper knowledge of who truly deserved assistance. The first woman did not pursue the subject further. In the afternoon, Mr. Gilbert Rowe visited the archive to consult certain property records, a task that required Price's assistance in locating the relevant documents. Rowe was a man of considerable prosperity and proportionate self-regard, accustomed to speaking his mind with the confidence that financial success often bestows. Yet when Price, in the course of helping him locate the necessary papers, happened to mention that he understood Rowe had purchased certain properties on the eastern edge of town some years previously, Rowe's response was markedly circumspect. "Property investments," said he, with a vagueness most uncharacteristic of a man who could typically recite the details of his holdings with exhaustive precision. "One acquires various parcels over time. Difficult to recall the specifics of every transaction." He gathered his documents with unseemly haste and departed before Price could offer further assistance. By evening, when Price returned to his modest lodgings above the stationer's shop, he had accumulated a collection of observations that, taken individually, might have signified nothing of particular consequence. A careful neutrality in discussing the previous evening's gathering, a reluctance to engage with topics that might lead towards certain names or circumstances, a general atmosphere of unease concealed beneath the surface of ordinary discourse. Yet taken together, these observations suggested something more substantial, that Hedgemore was engaged in a collective act of forgetting, or rather, of choosing not to remember. The town had not lost its memory of the Ashworth family. It had instead agreed, through some mechanism that required no formal articulation, that certain recollections were unsuitable for public acknowledgement. Price sat by his window as darkness gathered, watching the lamps being lit along Mill Street, their warm glow gradually replacing the fading daylight. He thought of the moment at Mrs. Harrow's gathering, when Miss Fenwick had spoken that name, of the silence that had followed, and of the swift, nearly invisible movements by which normal conversation had been restored. He thought of his own small action in that moment, the adjustment of a candlestick that required no adjustment, and recognised it now for what it had been, not mere nervous habit, but an instinctive contribution to the preservation of peace through the suppression of truth. For Price understood, with a clarity born of long observation, that silence was not always the absence of speech. Sometimes it was a presence in itself, a deliberate thing carefully maintained and collectively enforced. The question that now occupied his mind was not what had happened to the Ashworth family, though that was certainly a question worth pursuing. The more pressing question was why their memory had become something that Hedgemore found it necessary to suppress, and what cost that suppression might be exacting from the town's collective conscience. Outside his window, the evening deepened into night. The lamps burned steadily. The town settled into its customary quietness, and in the archive of Mr. Leonard Price's patient mind, a determination took shape, to understand what had been deliberately forgotten, and to discover whether the silence that now lay over Hedgemore was the silence of peace, or merely the silence of something carefully buried, waiting with infinite patience to be unearthed. Chapter 4: Questions that Found No Welcome. The week that followed Christmas possessed that peculiar quality which attends the interval between one year's ending and another's commencement, when time itself seems to pause in contemplation of what has passed and what is yet to come. In Hedgemore, this period was typically marked by a general diminution of activity. Shops closed early, social obligations relaxed their grip, and the populace retreated into domestic comforts with the satisfied air of those who have fulfilled their seasonal duties and earned a period of respite. Yet beneath this surface tranquillity, Mr. Leonard Price pursued his quiet inquiries with that patient determination which characterised his approach to all matters requiring careful investigation. He did not, it must be emphasised, conduct himself with the aggressive curiosity of a magistrate seeking evidence, nor with the intrusive nosiness of those persons who mistake gossip for genuine understanding. Rather, he simply listened with somewhat greater attention than was his custom, and occasionally, when opportunity presented itself naturally, ventured observations that might encourage others to speak more freely than they otherwise might have done. His first substantial conversation occurred quite by accident on the morning of December the 28th, when he encountered Reverend Merton in the churchyard of St. Stephen's. The clergyman was examining the memorial stones with an expression of mild concern, having apparently discovered that several required attention from the stonemason before further deterioration rendered their inscriptions illegible. "Good morning, Reverend," said Price, raising his hat with proper courtesy. "I trust you enjoyed Mrs. Harrow's gathering the other evening?" Reverend Merton turned with a smile that suggested relief at the interruption of melancholy contemplation. "Ah, Mr. Price, good morning, indeed. Yes, yes, a most pleasant evening. Mrs. Harrow surpassed herself, as she invariably does. Such occasions remind us of the bonds that unite a Christian community. He paused, his smile maintaining its position, while something in his eyes suggested less certainty than his words conveyed. One hopes that all present found the evening agreeable. I believe they did, replied Price carefully, though I noticed Miss Fenwick seemed somewhat subdued after her remark about the Ashworth family. I wonder if she felt she had spoken out of turn. The effect of this observation upon the Reverend was both immediate and instructive. His expression shifted through several attitudes in rapid succession: surprise, discomfort, and finally a kind of practiced serenity that seemed to require conscious effort to maintain. Miss Fenwick is sometimes given to nostalgic recollection, he said, his tone achieving that particular quality of gentle dismissal which clergy often employ when wishing to discourage further inquiry. The Christmas season naturally turns our thoughts to those who are no longer among us, though in the case of the Ashworths, of course, they are not deceased, but merely distant. Yorkshire, I believe Mrs. Harrow mentioned. Indeed, said Price, allowing a pause to develop before continuing. I confess my own recollection of the family is somewhat vague. They departed rather suddenly, did they not? Reverend Merton's gaze drifted toward the church spire, as though seeking guidance from that elevated source. These matters are often difficult to recall with precision after so many years. Families come and go, Mr. Price. The reasons for their movements are their own concern, and not, I think, suitable subjects for speculation. He returned his attention to Price with renewed determination. I am reminded of our Lord's injunction to let the dead bury their dead, though of course the Ashworths are not dead, merely absent, which is quite a different matter, and yet the principle, I believe, remains applicable. Some things are best left in the past where they belong. Forgiveness, then, rather than examination, suggested Price mildly. Precisely. The Reverend seized upon this offering with evident gratitude. Forgiveness without the necessity of endless rehearsal of past difficulties. The Christian approach, I should say, is to acknowledge human frailty while extending charity toward all parties. Mrs. Harrow displayed admirable wisdom in redirecting conversation the other evening. Such discretion serves the community far better than would any amount of, that is to say. He faltered, apparently realizing he had said rather more than he intended. Of uncomfortable remembering, Price supplied gently. Reverend Merton looked at him with an expression that combined gratitude and wariness in equal measure. You have always struck me, Mr. Price, as a man of considerable understanding. I trust you will employ that understanding in recognizing that some questions, while perhaps possessing intellectual merit, serve no practical purpose in the present day. The past cannot be altered. The Ashworths have made their way in the world, and Hedgemere has continued its existence without them. What benefit could possibly arise from disturbing settled matters? The benefit of truth, suggested Price, though without argumentative emphasis. Truth, repeated the Reverend, as though tasting the word and finding it somewhat bitter, is a complex commodity, Mr. Price. What appears true from one perspective may seem quite different from another. I recall a sermon I delivered some years ago on the subject of charitable interpretation, which emphasized that we must always consider circumstances we may not fully understand. The Ashworths, I am certain, would not wish their difficulties to become subjects of public discussion, nor would those who, that is to say, those who acted according to their best judgment at the time, would surely prefer that bygones remain bygones. Price inclined his head in acknowledgment of this sentiment, though whether he agreed with it was a question he did not immediately address. The Reverend, apparently satisfied that his point had been adequately expressed, excused himself with the explanation that his sister would be expecting him for their midday meal, and departed with a rapidity that suggested relief at having concluded a conversation that had strayed into uncomfortable territory. That afternoon, Price found opportunity to speak with Mrs. Harrow herself, who had visited the archive to consult certain records pertaining to a charitable trust in which she took considerable interest. She received his assistance with her customary graciousness, though Price detected a slight wariness in her manner, as though she had been warned to expect questions she might prefer not to answer. "I hope you felt your Christmas gathering achieved its intended purpose," said Price, as he located the relevant documents for her examination. "I believe it did," replied Mrs. Harrow, her attention ostensibly fixed upon the papers before her. "One cannot, of course, control every aspect of such occasions. Unexpected remarks will occasionally be made, but a practiced hostess learns to navigate such moments without allowing them to disrupt the general harmony." "Miss Fenwick's mention of the Ashworth family, you mean?" Mrs. Harrow's hand paused momentarily in turning a page. "Miss Fenwick is a dear woman, though sometimes given to speaking without full consideration of her words' effect. The Ashworths were neighbours of ours many years ago. Their circumstances became difficult. They chose to seek opportunities elsewhere. It was all perfectly understandable, though naturally one regrets when any family finds it necessary to depart." "Were the circumstances of their departure particularly unfortunate?" inquired Price. Mrs. Harrow raised her eyes to meet his with an expression that combined authority with a warning so delicate that a less perceptive observer might have missed it entirely. "Mr. Price, you have always impressed me as a man who understands the importance of discretion. Surely you recognise that some matters, while perhaps not secret in any dramatic sense, are nevertheless not appropriate for general discussion. The Ashworths made decisions based upon their own assessment of their situation. The town responded as it thought best. To revisit those decisions now, when all parties have moved forward, would serve no useful purpose and might cause unnecessary distress." "A misunderstanding, then?" suggested Price carefully. "I did not say that," replied Mrs. Harrow, her tone sharpening slightly. "I said the matter was closed. There is a considerable difference, Mr. Price, between forgetting and choosing not to remember. Hedgemore has chosen the latter course, and I would strongly encourage you to respect that choice." She gathered her papers with decisive movements. "I believe I have found what I required. Thank you for your assistance." She departed with that air of finality which brooks no further discussion, leaving Price alone in the archive with his thoughts and a growing conviction that whatever had occurred concerning the Ashworth family, it had involved more than simple misfortune or ordinary difficulty. The town's determination not to speak of it suggested guilt rather than mere regret, and the careful distinction Mrs. Harrow had drawn between forgetting and choosing not to remember implied that the truth, while known, had been deliberately suppressed. As evening approached and Price prepared to close the archive for the day, he reflected upon what he had learned. The Reverend spoke of forgiveness without examination. Mrs. Harrow insisted upon moving forward without looking back. Both advocated for silence, not from ignorance but from policy, and both, Price suspected, carried knowledge they had no intention of sharing unless circumstances compelled them to do so. Though questions had been asked, they had found no welcome, yet their very rejection confirmed what Price had begun to suspect, that beneath Hedgemore's peaceful surface lay something the town had agreed to bury, and that his gentle probing had disturbed the earth that covered it, however slightly. Whether that disturbance would prove beneficial or harmful remained to be discovered. But Price knew with certainty that having begun his inquiry, he could not in conscience abandon it simply because it made others uncomfortable. Truth, as he understood it, was not always convenient, but convenience, he believed, was a poor substitute for honesty, and silence, no matter how comfortable, eventually demanded to be broken. Chapter 5. Familiar Comforts Carefully Preserved. The last days of December passed with that accelerating quality which characterises the year's ending, as though time itself grew impatient to complete its appointed cycle and commence anew. In Hedgemore, the interval between Christmas and the New Year was traditionally devoted to those social obligations that had been deferred during the busier weeks of Advent, and to the general tidying of accounts, both financial and social, which allowed one to enter the coming year with a clear conscience and an orderly ledger. It was during this period that Mr. Price found himself observing with increasing clarity the wider circle of persons whose lives had become entangled, in ways both obvious and subtle, with the question that now occupied his thoughts. For it had become apparent that the departure of the Ashworth family, far from being a simple matter of one household relocating for reasons of their own, had created ripples in Hedgemoor's social fabric that persisted long after the family themselves had vanished from the town's daily existence. The first of these persons whose circumstances merited closer attention was Mr. Gilbert Rowe, whose warehouses stood at the eastern edge of town and whose prosperity was such that his opinions on commercial matters were generally received as though handed down from some higher authority on trade and finance. Rowe was a man of perhaps 55 years, broad of frame and ruddy of complexion, possessed of that hearty manner which successful merchants often cultivate as a means of demonstrating that wealth has not rendered them unapproachable. Price had known Rowe for many years, though their acquaintance had never progressed beyond the cordial formality that exists between men whose spheres of activity rarely intersect. Yet as Price considered the matter, certain recollections acquired new significance. The property on the eastern edge of town where the Ashworth family had once resided had been purchased by Rowe shortly after their departure. The warehouse that now occupied an adjacent plot had been constructed within 2 years of that acquisition, and Rowe's expansion from a modestly successful trader to a merchant of considerable standing had commenced, if Price's memory served correctly, at precisely the period when the Ashworths had ceased to be part of Hedgemoor's commercial landscape. These facts, taken individually, might signify nothing more than the ordinary operations of commerce and the natural progression of business opportunity. Yet combined with Rowe's evident discomfort when the subject of his property acquisitions had been raised during their recent encounter, they suggested a narrative that bore closer examination. Price arranged to encounter Rowe again quite by chance, or rather, through the sort of carefully orchestrated accident that appears spontaneous while being nothing of the kind. He positioned himself outside the Crown and Anchor Inn at the hour when Rowe customarily took refreshment, and expressed surprise and pleasure at the merchant's appearance. Mr. Rowe, what fortunate timing! Might I impose upon you for a moment's conversation? I find myself curious about Hedgemoor's commercial development over the past decades, and you are certainly the man best positioned to illuminate the subject. Rowe's expression suggested he would have preferred to decline, but the public nature of the encounter and Price's carefully innocuous phrasing made refusal difficult without appearing churlish. "I suppose I might spare a few minutes, he said, with the air of one granting a considerable favour, though I cannot imagine my business dealings would interest a scholar such as yourself." They settled at a corner table with glasses of mild ale, and Price began his inquiry with questions so general and apparently aimless that Rowe's initial wariness gradually subsided. He spoke freely of the growth of the trade, the expansion of the railway's reach, and the various opportunities that had presented themselves to men of vision and capital. It was only when the conversation had achieved a comfortable rhythm that Price introduced the subject he truly wished to explore. "I recall the Eastern District was rather different 15 years ago," he remarked, as though the observation had just occurred to him. "Fewer commercial properties, more residential dwellings. The transformation has been quite remarkable." Rowe's jovial manner contracted slightly, like a sail when the wind shifts. "Progress, Mr. Price. Some understand its necessity, others resist it. The town required warehouse facilities. I provided them. Those who benefited from my investment have no cause for complaint." "I intended no criticism," Price assured him gently. "I merely observe that change sometimes displaces as well as improves. The families who once resided in that district, for instance, must have required alternative accommodation." "Those who wished to remain in Hedgemoor found suitable lodgings," said Rowe, his tone becoming defensive. "Those who chose to depart did so of their own volition. I purchased property that was available for purchase. If certain persons found themselves unable to maintain their holdings, that was hardly my responsibility." Price allowed this statement to settle between them before responding. "The Ashworth family, for instance." The effect was immediate. Rowe's complexion, already ruddy, deepened to a shade approaching crimson. I'll not discuss individual transactions, Mr. Price. Business confidentiality, you understand. What passed between myself and other parties is not suitable material for casual conversation. He drained his glass with abrupt efficiency. I'm afraid I've remembered an appointment that requires my immediate attention. Good day to you. He departed before Price could offer any response, leaving behind an impression of guilt so palpable that it lingered in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. The second person whose circumstances demanded Price's attention was Miss Clara Fenwick, whose mention of the Ashworth family at Mrs. Harrow's gathering had initiated the entire sequence of uncomfortable revelations. Miss Fenwick resided in a handsome house on Parsons Lane, maintained by the inheritance her father had left upon his death some 8 years previously. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, possessed of quiet dignity, and that particular quality of reserved kindness which often characterizes those who have witnessed considerable suffering in their professional proximity to illness and death. Price called upon her on the morning of December the 30th, the pretext being a question regarding certain medical records that had been donated to the town archive by her late father's estate. She received him in her sitting room, a chamber of modest elegance where afternoon light filtered through lace curtains with subdued grace. "Mr. Price, how pleasant to see you," she said, though her expression suggested she had anticipated his visit and viewed it with mixed feelings. "I trust this concerns my father's papers?" "In part," admitted Price, settling into the chair she indicated, "though I confess I also hoped you might indulge my curiosity regarding a matter you yourself raised at Mrs. Harrow's gathering." Miss Fenwick's hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, suddenly found it necessary to adjust her shawl. "I fear I spoke without proper consideration that evening. Mrs. Harrow was quite right to redirect conversation. Some memories are best left undisturbed." "Yet you raised the memory nonetheless," Price observed gently. "Might I inquire what prompted you to do so?" She was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed upon the window as though seeking guidance from the grey December sky beyond. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of long-suppressed feeling. "I was fond of Mrs. Ashworth, Mr. Price." She was a woman of considerable courage and dignity, facing difficulties that would have crushed lesser spirits. When they departed Hedgemore, I continue to feel that the town failed her, failed them. And at Christmas, when we speak so readily of charity and goodwill, the contrast between our professed values and our actual conduct becomes rather difficult to ignore. What manner of difficulties did the family face? Miss Fenwick's expression grew troubled. "I am not certain I should speak of it. Mrs. Harrow made her wishes quite clear, and I have no desire to create further discomfort. Yet—" She paused, seeming to reach some internal decision. "Mr. Ashworth's business encountered troubles. Trade difficulties, I believe, though the details were never entirely clear to me. They required assistance. The town spoke much of helping neighbours in distress, as towns always do. But when actual assistance was needed, financial aid, extended credit, the sort of practical support that makes fine words into meaningful action, suddenly there were reasons why help could not be provided, conditions that could not be met, delays that became indefinite. And Mr. Rowe was among those most vocal in his expressions of sympathy," said Miss Fenwick with a bitterness that seemed foreign to her gentle nature, "and most absent when actual aid was required. Yet within months of the Ashworths' departure, he had acquired their property at a price I suspect was rather less than its true value. I cannot prove impropriety, Mr. Price, but neither can I quite convince myself of its absence." "You believe the family was forced out?" "I believe," said Miss Fenwick carefully, "that what appeared to be unfortunate circumstances may have been rendered more unfortunate by the calculated inaction of those who stood to benefit from another's distress. And I believe that Hedgemore, having allowed this to occur, finds it more comfortable to forget than to acknowledge what was done, or rather what was not done when action was required." She rose, signalling that the interview had reached its natural conclusion. "I have said more than is perhaps wise, Mr. Price. I trust you will use this information with discretion. Mrs. Harrow is not incorrect when she suggests that revisiting the past serves little purpose. Yet I confess I find comfort in knowing that someone at least is willing to acknowledge that the past existed and that it was not entirely creditable to those of us who lived through it. Price departed with gratitude for her honesty and a deepening understanding of what had occurred. The pattern was becoming clearer. A family in difficulty, assistance promised but not provided, opportunities seized by those who had withheld help, and a collective decision to bury the memory of what had been allowed to happen. It was not dramatic villainy, but something perhaps more troubling, the quiet cruelty of respectable people, choosing comfort over conscience, and then agreeing to forget they had ever made such a choice. The truth was emerging slowly and reluctantly, like something long buried that resists being brought back into the light. Chapter 6. What the town agreed not to recall. The final day of the year arrived with that mixture of melancholy and anticipation which attends all significant transitions, when one finds oneself suspended between what has been and what is yet to come, belonging fully to neither state but partaking somewhat of both. In Hedgemore the morning dawned grey and still, with clouds that hung low over the rooftops as though uncertain whether to release their burden of snow or to carry it onwards to some other destination. Mr. Leonard Price spent the morning at the town archive, though his duties on this particular day were more form than substance, as few persons sought records or documents when their thoughts were occupied with preparations for evening celebrations. Yet it was precisely this quietness that allowed Price to pursue the investigation that had come to dominate his thinking in the days since Mrs. Harrow's gathering. The archive possessed, among its many collections, a complete set of parish records dating back more than a century, meticulously maintained by a succession of clerks whose dedication to accurate record-keeping had bequeathed to posterity a remarkably detailed account of Hedgemore's civic life. Price had spent many hours over the years familiarising himself with these documents, and he now turned to them with the specific purpose of tracing the history of the Ashworth family's residence in the town. The earliest mention he could locate appeared in the register for 1859, when one Thomas Ashworth, merchant, had taken up residence at number 12 Eastfield Lane, together with his wife Margaret and their 3 children. The record was unremarkable in itself, merely noting the family's arrival and their registration with St. Stephen's Church. Subsequent entries documented the usual milestones: births baptised, charitable subscriptions paid, rates assessed and collected. The Ashworths appeared, from these official notations, to have been precisely the sort of respectable, modestly prosperous family that formed the backbone of English provincial life. Yet as Price continued his examination, he began to notice certain absences that were as revealing as any positive evidence might have been. In 1868, Thomas Ashworth's name disappeared from the list of contributors to the Church Restoration Fund, though he had been a regular subscriber in previous years. In 1869, the assessment records showed the Eastfield Lane property as having declined significantly in value, and in the winter of 1870, the family's name vanished entirely from the parish register, with a notation so brief as to be almost perfunctory, "removed to Yorkshire." Price sat back in his chair and considered these sparse facts. They confirmed what Miss Fenwick had suggested, that the Ashworths had experienced some manner of financial difficulty beginning around 1868, and that their departure 2 years later had not been a matter of choice but of necessity. Yet the official records offered no explanation of what had caused their troubles, nor why a family that had been established residents for nearly a decade should have found it necessary to depart so completely that their very memory had become something the town preferred not to acknowledge. It was in searching for supplementary documentation that Price made his most significant discovery. Tucked between the bound volumes of parish records, apparently misfiled years previously, was a folder containing correspondence related to a petition that had been circulated in the winter of 1869. The petition itself was written in a clerk's careful hand, though the signatures appended to it were those of various townspeople. Its language was formal, almost legalistic, requesting that the parish council establish a relief fund for families facing temporary financial hardship due to circumstances beyond their control. The petition had been initiated, Price noted with particular interest by Thomas Ashworth himself. It did not request assistance for his own family directly, but rather proposed a general mechanism by which any resident facing difficulty might receive aid. The signatures supporting it represented a broad cross-section of Hedgemore society, including several names Price recognised from Mrs. Harrow's recent gathering. Attached to the petition was a second document, this one bearing the stamp of the parish council and dated some 3 months after the petition had been submitted. It was a formal response, and its language, while couched in expressions of sympathy and concern, amounted to a comprehensive rejection. The council acknowledged the worthy intentions behind the proposal, but cited various practical difficulties: the challenge of determining genuine need, the risk of encouraging dependency, the limited resources available for such purposes, and the general principle that individual charity, privately administered, was preferable to any institutional mechanism that might be subject to abuse. The response was signed by 3 council members, among them the late Mr. George Harrow, whose widow now presided over Hedgemoor's social life with such assured authority. Price read both documents several times, his understanding of what had occurred acquiring greater clarity with each reading. Thomas Ashworth, facing difficulties himself, had sought to establish a system that would help not only his own family, but any neighbour who might encounter similar troubles. The town had refused, not from cruelty, but from that particular form of caution which prefers abstract principles to concrete assistance, and having refused to create any mechanism for organised help, the town had then watched as the Ashworth family's situation deteriorated beyond recovery, their departure becoming inevitable once their resources were exhausted and no communal support materialised. What transformed this sequence from mere misfortune into something more troubling was what had followed. The property the Ashworths had been forced to relinquish had been acquired by Gilbert Rowe at what was almost certainly a depressed price. The warehouse subsequently constructed on adjacent land had contributed to Rowe's prosperity, and Mrs. Harrow, whose late husband had signed the rejection of the relief fund, had inherited not only his property, but also his position of social prominence, a prominence maintained partly through the selective forgetting of occasions when principle had been allowed to triumph over compassion. Price carefully returned the documents to their folder, though he made detailed notes of their contents in his own records. He understood now why Hedgemore had agreed not to recall the Ashworth family. It was not that their story involved dramatic scandal or shocking impropriety. Rather, it revealed something perhaps more uncomfortable: that respectable people acting from ostensibly reasonable motives could collectively allow harm to occur through inaction and then collectively agree to forget that they had ever made such a choice. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the archive room, Price found himself reflecting upon his own position within this history. He had been present in Hedgemore during the relevant years, though younger and less observant than he was now. He recalled, with the uncomfortable clarity that accompanies unwelcome self-examination, that he too had heard of the Ashworths' difficulties, and he too had done precisely nothing to assist them. He had not signed the petition when it was circulated, having judged it none of his concern. He had not offered private aid, having convinced himself that others more prosperous bore that responsibility. He had, in short, participated in the same collective failure he now sought to expose, differing from his neighbours only in that he had been more obscure and therefore less culpable in degree, though not in kind. This recognition brought with it a certain humility that had been absent from his earlier inquiries. He was not, he understood, some external judge examining the failings of others. He was a participant in the community he investigated, complicit in its silences even as he sought to break them. If he pursued this matter further, it would not be from any position of moral superiority, but rather from a recognition that complicity unacknowledged becomes complicity continued, and that silence, however comfortable it might be in the present, exacts costs that eventually demand accounting. The question now confronting Price was what, if anything, should be done with the knowledge he had acquired. The Ashworths were gone, scattered to whatever life they had built in Yorkshire. The principals in Hedgemore's failure, Mr. Harrow, Thomas Ashworth himself, and others who had been active at the time were mostly dead or departed. Those who remained were respectable citizens whose current lives bore little obvious relationship to decisions made 15 years previously. What purpose would be served by insisting that they confront a past they had agreed to forget? Yet even as Price formulated this question, he recognized that it contained within itself the seeds of its own answer. The purpose would be served not by punishment or public shame, but by acknowledgement, by the simple recognition that something had occurred which should not have occurred, and that the town's prosperity and comfort rested partly upon foundations less solid than its residents preferred to believe. By the restoration of memory where deliberate forgetting had been maintained, and by the acceptance of shared responsibility where individual absolution had been too readily granted. As Price prepared to close the archive for the day and venture out into the gathering dusk of the year's last evening, he carried with him both the weight of what he had discovered and the uncertain knowledge of what he might choose to do with that discovery. The truth was now clear to him. Whether it would become clear to Hedgemere, and whether that clarity would prove ultimately beneficial or merely disturbing, remained questions that only time and his own conscience could adequately resolve. The year was ending, a new one would soon commence, and Price found himself hoping, with an earnestness that surprised him, that the new year might bring to Hedgemore what the old year had so carefully avoided: the courage to remember what had been deliberately forgotten, and the wisdom to learn from what memory revealed. Chapter 7. And earlier. Winter long unspoken. The new year arrived with snow, that most democratizing of natural phenomena, which falls upon rich and poor alike, and renders all distinctions of rank temporarily invisible beneath its uniform covering. By the morning of January 1st, Hedgemore presented a landscape transformed, the familiar streets made strange by their altered contours, the customary sounds of the town muffled into a quietness that seemed almost reverential. It was as though nature herself had decided that the year should commence with a fresh page, unmarked by the smudges and erasures of previous chapters. Yet for Mr. Leonard Price, who stood at his window watching the snow continue its gentle descent, the symbolism of new beginnings felt somewhat hollow. The truth he had uncovered regarding the Ashworth family remained as present in his mind as it had been before the calendar's arbitrary division, and the question of what to do with that truth pressed upon him with increased urgency. For knowledge, once acquired, creates obligations that ignorance does not, and Price found himself burdened with an awareness he could neither dismiss nor satisfactorily resolve. It was during these contemplative hours that memory, that curious faculty, which so often withholds itself when actively sought yet volunteers unbidden at unexpected moments, presented Price with recollections he had not consciously retained. They came to him in fragments, images and impressions from that winter 15 years previous, when he himself had been a young man of 20, newly arrived in Hedgemore to assist in the town archive, uncertain of his place in the community, and careful not to presume familiarity where he had not yet earned it. He remembered, with the peculiar vividness that sometimes attends long-buried memories, a particular January morning not unlike this one, when snow had fallen with similar abundance. He had been walking to his employment when he encountered a small group gathered outside the office of Mr. Edmund Cartwright, who had served as parish clerk until his death some 8 years ago. The group consisted of perhaps half a dozen persons, their faces marked by that expression of determined hopefulness which characterizes those who have come to petition authority and are not entirely confident of receiving satisfaction. Among them had been a man of middle years, respectably dressed, but with an air of anxiety that no amount of proper attire could entirely conceal. Price had not known him then, though he understood now that this must have been Thomas Ashworth. The man had been speaking with quiet earnestness to those gathered around him, explaining, Price now recalled with uncomfortable clarity, that he sought only to establish a mechanism that would help any family facing hardship, not merely his own. His manner had been neither demanding nor servile, but rather carried that quality of reasoned appeal which assumes that rational argument will be met with rational response, Price remembered pausing briefly, interested in spite of himself, before continuing to his duties. He had not signed the petition when it was later circulated through the town, though he recalled seeing it and considering doing so. Something had prevented him. Perhaps the natural caution of a young man uncertain of his standing, perhaps the vague sense that such matters were the concern of more established citizens, perhaps simply the human tendency to avoid involvement in affairs that might prove controversial or uncomfortable. He had told himself that his abstention made no practical difference, that there were surely others more influential who would support the measure if it had genuine merit. He recalled, too, the gradual awareness that had developed over the subsequent months that the Ashworth family was experiencing difficulty. It had been spoken of in that particular manner which townspeople employ when discussing a neighbour's misfortune, with expressed sympathy and carefully maintained distance, acknowledging the situation while simultaneously asserting one's own separation from it. There had been talk of business reversals, of credit becoming difficult to obtain, of a family doing its best to maintain appearances while circumstances steadily deteriorated. Price had observed Thomas Ashworth on several occasions during that period, though always from a distance. He remembered seeing him in earnest conversation with Moreau outside the latter's warehouse, the discussion clearly difficult though its exact nature remained obscure. He recalled noticing Mrs. Ashworth at the draper's shop examining fabric with the particular care of one for whom every purchase must be weighed against limited resources. He had witnessed the gradual withdrawal of the family from the town's social life, their presence at church services becoming less regular, their participation in community events diminishing until it ceased altogether. And through it all there had been talk, sympathetic talk certainly, expressing regret at the family's difficulties and hoping for their eventual recovery. Yet it had been talk without action, sympathy without practical assistance, concern without commitment. The town had watched, had spoken kindly, and had done precisely nothing. When the Ashworths finally departed in late 1870, their leaving had been so quiet as to be almost unnoticed. 1 week they were present, diminished and struggling. The next week they were gone, and the town had continued its existence as though a family of 5 persons had simply evaporated into the winter air. Price had been aware of their departure. He had noted it, filed it mentally as one files any minor change in the familiar landscape, and then turned his attention to other matters. He had not inquired where they had gone, whether they had arrived safely at their destination, whether they had found the better circumstances they presumably sought. He had simply accepted their absence and had allowed it to fade into the general background of forgotten things. Now, standing at his window 15 years later, Price understood with painful clarity that his own role in this history had been neither innocent nor inconsequential. He had not actively harmed the Ashworth family. He had not voted against the relief fund or refused them direct aid when requested. But he had stood by, had watched, had allowed events to unfold without once considering that his inaction was itself a choice, and that collective inaction, when sufficiently widespread, becomes indistinguishable from collective decision. The young man he had been would have insisted that he bore no responsibility for circumstances beyond his control, that he was too junior, too newly arrived, too uncertain of his position to intervene in matters that more established citizens were better positioned to address. Yet the man he had become recognized these justifications for what they were, comfortable evasions that preserved his self-regard at the cost of honest self-examination. What struck him most forcefully was the recognition that his current investigation of the past was not, as he had perhaps unconsciously assumed, the action of one seeking to hold others accountable for their failures. Rather, it was an attempt to hold himself accountable, to acknowledge his own complicity in events he had long since relegated to the category of things forgotten because they were too uncomfortable to remember. This realization brought with it a curious sense of liberation. He was not investigating the Ashworth matter as an external judge, but as a participant seeking to understand his own history. He was not exposing others' failings, but acknowledging shared responsibility. And if he chose to bring this history back into the light, it would not be to assign blame, but to offer acknowledgement, to say simply and honestly that something had occurred which should not have occurred, and that all of them, himself included, bore some portion of responsibility for having allowed it to happen. The snow continued to fall, covering the streets with its blank whiteness. Yet Price understood that the past could not be so easily buried, that memory had a tendency to surface despite all efforts at suppression, and that the only path to genuine peace lay not in forgetting, but in remembering honestly, accepting what memory revealed, and choosing to do better in the future than one had done in the past. As the morning progressed and the town began to stir beneath its covering of snow, Price made his decision. He would not allow the matter to remain buried. He would speak of what he had discovered, not with accusation but with invitation, an invitation to remember together what had been forgotten separately, and to consider whether the town that had failed the Ashworth family might yet redeem that process of failure through honest acknowledgement and thoughtful action. It would not be easy. Mrs. Harrow would resist, Reverend Merton would counsel caution, Mr. Rowe would protest. Yet Price believed, with a conviction that surprised him in its strength, that truth, however uncomfortable, was ultimately more valuable than the false peace maintained through collective amnesia. The town had chosen to forget. He would ask it to remember, and in that remembering perhaps lay the possibility of becoming the community it claimed to be, rather than merely the community it appeared to be when viewed from a comfortable distance. The year was new, the snow was fresh, and Price carried within him the hope, fragile but persistent, that acknowledgement might prove the first step towards something approaching redemption, not through dramatic gestures or public penance, but through the quiet, steady work of facing honestly what had been done, accepting responsibility for it, and resolving to act differently when next the opportunity arose to choose between comfort and conscience, between principle abstractly stated and compassion practically demonstrated. The truth had been buried long enough. It was time, Price believed, to bring it gently but firmly back into the light, and to trust that those who had hidden from it might find, in facing it honestly, a peace more genuine than the uneasy quiet they had maintained through years of deliberate forgetting. Chapter 8. The Burden Quietly Accepted. The first week of January passed with that tentative quality which characterises all beginnings, when the novelty of change has not yet settled into the comfortable familiarity of routine. In Hedgemore, the snow that had fallen on New Year's Day gradually yielded to grey skies and intermittent rain, transforming the pristine whiteness into slush, and revealing once again the ordinary landscape of streets and buildings that lay beneath nature's temporary decoration. It was during this interval that Mr. Leonard Price found himself engaged in a curious form of social choreography, one that required considerable delicacy and no small amount of patience. For he had determined to speak of what he had discovered, yet he understood that such speaking must be undertaken with care, lest it produce defensiveness rather than reflection, resistance rather than acknowledgement. Truth, he had come to recognise, was not a weapon to be wielded, but a gift to be offered, and its reception depended greatly upon the manner of its presentation. His first conversation took place on a rain-dampened afternoon when he encountered Miss Clara Fenwick quite by chance near the lending library. She greeted him with evident warmth, though her expression suggested she anticipated that their exchange might venture beyond pleasantries. "Mr. Price, I confess I have been expecting to hear from you," she said, once they had moved beneath the shelter of the library's modest portico. "I assume your inquiries have borne fruit?" "They have," Price acknowledged, "though perhaps not in the manner I initially expected. I have learned what occurred, Miss Fenwick, yet I find myself understanding it differently than I might have done before undertaking the investigation." She regarded him with that intelligent attention which had made her father such a valued physician. "How so?" "I began by seeking to understand others' actions," Price explained carefully. "I end by recognising my own inaction. The distinction, I find, is considerable. It transforms judgment into acknowledgement, and accusation into confession." Miss Fenwick was silent for a moment, her gaze turning toward the rain-slicked street beyond their shelter. When she spoke, her voice carried a note of relief. "Then you understand that we were all complicit, in our various ways. Some through active refusal, others through passive acceptance. The guilt, if we must call it that, is distributed widely enough that no single person can claim to bear the whole of it, yet concentrated sufficiently that none of us can honestly claim to be entirely free of it." "Precisely," said Price. "And it is this understanding that I wish to bring to the town's attention, not as condemnation, but as invitation. An invitation to remember honestly and to consider what such remembering might teach us about our obligations to one another." Miss Fenwick nodded slowly. "Mrs. Harrow will not welcome such an invitation." "I suspect not," Price agreed. "Yet I believe her resistance stems not from callousness, but from fear. Fear that acknowledgement will diminish her standing, that confession will undermine the respect she has worked to maintain. If I can help her understand that acknowledgement might actually strengthen rather than weaken her position, that honest remembering might earn more genuine respect than comfortable forgetting, then perhaps she will be willing to consider what I propose." "You credit her with more flexibility than I might," observed Miss Fenwick, though not without sympathy. "Yet I hope you are correct. And Mr. Price, when you do speak publicly of this matter, I hope you will remember to include in your account the fact that some of us, at least, did not entirely forget. That memory, even uncomfortable memory, was preserved by those who valued truth over comfort." Price assured her that he would indeed remember her role, and they parted with mutual understanding, each carrying away from the encounter a sense that the burden of difficult knowledge, when shared, became somewhat lighter even as it remained substantial. His second conversation, which occurred 2 days later, was with Reverend Merton, whom Price invited to take tea at the small establishment near the archive where both men occasionally took refreshment. The Reverend arrived with evident trepidation, his round face suggesting that he would have preferred to avoid the meeting, but could not discover a polite means of doing so. "I imagine you wish to discuss the Ashworth matter," said Reverend Merton, once they were settled with their cups before them. "I must tell you, Mr. Price, that I remain uncertain whether such discussion serves any beneficial purpose." "I understand your hesitation," Price replied gently. "Yet I wonder whether we might consider the matter from a theological perspective. Does not Christianity teach that confession precedes forgiveness? That acknowledgement of sin is the necessary first step toward redemption?" The Reverend's expression suggested he had not expected this particular approach. "It does, certainly, though I am not certain the analogy applies precisely to our current situation." "Does it not?" Price asked. "The town made choices, or failed to make them, that resulted in harm to a family under its care. That harm was then forgotten, or rather, deliberately not remembered. Surely this constitutes precisely the sort of situation where honest acknowledgement would be appropriate, even necessary, if we are to claim any genuine adherence to the principles we profess." Reverend Merton was silent for a considerable interval, his tea cooling untouched before him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried less certainty than was typical of his pronouncements. "You shame me, Mr. Price, though I suspect that is not your intention. I have counselled for forgetting because I believed it served the cause of peace. Yet you suggest, I think, that such peace is false, that genuine peace requires honest confrontation with what we have done rather than comfortable avoidance of it." "I suggest only that we cannot forgive ourselves for something we refuse to acknowledge we have done," said Price quietly, "and that collective forgetting, while it may preserve surface harmony, exacts costs that accumulate over time, costs paid in diminished integrity, in weakened community, in the gradual erosion of those moral foundations we claim to value." The Reverend met his gaze directly. "What would you have me do?" "I would have you speak from the pulpit," Price answered. "Not with fire and condemnation, but with honesty and invitation. Tell the congregation what occurred. Acknowledge your own role in it, as I intend to acknowledge mine. and invite them to consider whether the community we might become through honest remembering might not be preferable to the community we have been through deliberate forgetting. Mrs. Harrow will be most displeased, observed the Reverend, though with less resistance than Price might have expected. Mrs. Harrow will be invited to join us in acknowledgement, said Price. Whether she accepts that invitation is her decision to make, yet I believe she deserves the opportunity to do so before assumptions are made about how she will respond. Reverend Merton departed the tea shop with much to consider, his expression suggesting that the conversation had disturbed comfortable certainties he had long maintained. Yet Price believed he detected, beneath the discomfort, something approaching relief, the relief that comes when one is finally permitted to speak truths that have been suppressed and to acknowledge burdens that have been carried in silence. It was on the following Sunday that Price paid his most difficult call, presenting himself at Ashdown House at an hour when he knew Mrs. Harrow would be receiving visitors. She greeted him with courtesy that barely concealed her wariness, and invited him into her sitting room with the air of one who knows an unpleasant conversation is about to occur and has resigned herself to enduring it. Mr. Price, she said once they were seated, I suspect you have come to lecture me about the Ashworth family. Not to lecture, Price replied, but to invite. I have discovered what occurred 15 years ago, Mrs. Harrow. I know about the relief fund that was proposed and rejected. I know about the choices that were made and the consequences that followed. Yet I have also discovered something else, that I myself was present during those events, and that I too failed to act when action was required. I am as complicit as anyone in what occurred. Mrs. Harrow's expression shifted from defensive wariness to something more complex. You acknowledge your own failings. I do, said Price simply, and in acknowledging them, I find I am less inclined to judge others for theirs. What I propose is not accusation, but invitation. An invitation to remember together what we have forgotten separately, and to consider what such remembering might teach us. And if I refuse? Asked Mrs. Harrow, though without the harshness Price might have expected. Then you refuse, said Price. I cannot compel acknowledgement, nor would I wish to do so. Yet I believe, Mrs. Harrow, that you are a woman of greater courage than you perhaps credit yourself with possessing, and I believe that honest acknowledgement, undertaken voluntarily and with genuine intention, might earn you more lasting respect than any amount of comfortable silence could ever provide. Mrs. Harrow was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze directed towards the window where rain continued its gentle descent. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight Price had not heard in it before. You ask a great deal, Mr. Price. I ask only what I am prepared to give myself, he replied. The acknowledgement of past failure, the acceptance of present responsibility, and the commitment to act differently in future. Nothing more, but certainly nothing less. She nodded slowly, and though she made no explicit commitment, Price sensed that his words had found their mark. The conversation continued for some minutes longer, touching upon practicalities and possibilities, before Price took his leave. As he walked back through the rain-washed streets, he carried with him the sense that something significant had shifted, that the burden of difficult truth, when accepted by multiple persons, became not heavier, but somehow more bearable, distributed across willing shoulders rather than borne in isolated silence. The work of acknowledgement had begun. How it would conclude remained uncertain. Yet Price believed, with a faith born of careful observation and patient hope, that Hedgemore might yet prove itself capable of the moral courage its situation required. Chapter 9. The Truth Allowed a Hearing. The second Sunday of January arrived with that clear, cold brightness which sometimes follows periods of rain, as though the atmosphere itself had been washed clean and restored to transparency. The church bells of St. Stephen's rang across Hedgemore with their customary clarity, summoning the faithful to morning service with that gentle insistence which the English countryside had answered for centuries. Mr. Leonard Price walked to church that morning with a mixture of anticipation and trepidation, knowing that Reverend Merton had determined to address the congregation on matters that had long been left unspoken. Whether this decision would prove wise or disastrous remained to be seen, yet Price could not help but feel that the attempt itself, regardless of its outcome, represented a step toward the kind of community Hedgemore might aspire to be, rather than merely the community it had been content to appear. The congregation assembled with its usual composition: the prominent families in the forward pews, the tradespeople and modest householders in the middle sections, and the less prosperous residents toward the rear. This arrangement maintained not through any written rule, but through that unspoken understanding which governed social position in provincial English towns. Mrs. Harrow occupied her customary place, her bearing suggesting nothing unusual in the day's proceedings. Miss Fenwick sat with quiet dignity in a pew she had inherited, so to speak, from her late father. Mr. Rowe was present, though Price noted that his expression carried a wariness that had not been there in previous weeks. The service proceeded through its familiar rhythms, hymns sung with varying degrees of enthusiasm, prayers recited with comfortable automaticity, readings delivered with appropriate solemnity. Yet there was something in the atmosphere, a quality of anticipation that suggested the congregation sensed this would not be an ordinary Sunday. Perhaps they had heard rumours. Perhaps they merely detected the unusual tension in Reverend Merton's manner as he prepared to deliver his sermon. Whatever the source of their intuition, the church seemed to settle into an expectant stillness as the Reverend ascended to the pulpit. He began conventionally enough, taking as his text a passage from the Gospel according to St. Luke. "If thy brother trespass against thee, rebuke him, and if he repent, forgive him." This was familiar territory, the sort of scriptural foundation upon which countless sermons had been constructed. Yet as Reverend Merton continued, it became clear that he intended to venture beyond comfortable abstractions into more troubling specifics. "We speak often in this church of forgiveness," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary, "and we congratulate ourselves, I think, on being a forgiving community. Yet I am compelled to ask this morning whether we have truly understood what forgiveness requires. Can we forgive what we refuse to acknowledge? Can we extend grace for transgressions we pretend never occurred? And if we cannot, then what have we been practicing all these years but a comfortable evasion dressed in the clothing of Christian virtue?" The congregation shifted in their pews, that subtle movement of collective unease which signals that a speaker has strayed from expected paths into territory less familiar and more dangerous. "Some 15 years ago," the Reverend continued, his voice steady despite visible nervousness, "a family in this parish found themselves facing difficulty. Their circumstances, which I shall not detail unnecessarily, had become desperate. They sought assistance, not merely for themselves, but proposed a system whereby any family facing hardship might receive aid. This proposal was rejected by those in positions of authority, among whom I must number myself, for though I was not then the rector of this parish, I was present, and I raised no voice in support of what was proposed." The stillness in the church had deepened into something approaching shock. Mrs. Harrow's expression remained carefully neutral, though her hands gripped her prayer book with sufficient force that the leather binding creased beneath her fingers. "The family departed," Reverend Merton said. "They left Hedgemore quietly, with a dignity, seeking elsewhere the support they could not find here, and we collectively agreed to forget them. Not through any conscious conspiracy, but through that more insidious form of collective amnesia, which allows comfortable people to avoid uncomfortable truths. We forgot because remembering was painful. We forgot because acknowledgement would have required us to confront our own failure. We forgot because it was easier than facing what we had allowed to occur." He paused, his gaze moving across the congregation, meeting eyes that now struck Curtin to meet his. "I do not speak this morning to assign blame to particular persons, for the guilt is distributed widely enough that we might all claim our portion. Nor do I speak to demand penance, as though harsh self-punishment might somehow undo what was done. I speak rather to invite acknowledgement, to suggest that we might find more peace in honest remembering than in comfortable forgetting, and to propose that our community might be stronger for having confronted its failings rather than weaker for having admitted them. The silence that followed this declaration was profound. It was not the silence of agreement, nor yet of disagreement, but rather the silence of a community confronting truth it had long avoided and uncertain how to respond. It was Mrs. Harrow who broke that silence. She rose from her pew with deliberate grace, her movement drawing every eye in the church. For a moment Price feared she intended to depart in protest, yet instead she turned to face the congregation, her expression no longer carefully neutral but rather openly troubled. "Reverend Merton speaks truth," she said, her voice carrying that authority which years of social prominence had cultivated. "My late husband was among those who voted to reject the relief fund. I have known this for many years. I have known too that in remaining silent about it, in allowing the matter to be forgotten, I participated in a kind of continued failure. I participated in it because I believed, as I suspect many of you believed, that silence was preferable to the discomfort of acknowledgement." She paused, and when she continued, her voice carried a note Price had not heard before. Not weakness, precisely, but rather a kind of strength that comes from surrendering the effort of maintaining appearances. "I was wrong," she said simply. "We were wrong. The Ashworth family deserved better from us than they received. And while we cannot undo what was done, we can at least acknowledge it honestly and resolve to act differently should such circumstances arise again. I propose that the relief fund originally suggested by Mr. Ashworth be established now, 15 years late, in recognition of what should have been done then, and as a promise to do better in future." The congregation seemed to exhale collectively. Miss Fenwick rose next, her movement graceful and unhurried. "I second Mrs. Harrow's proposal," she said clearly, "and I suggest that the fund bear the Ashworth name, not as memorial to the dead, but as acknowledgement of debt owed to the living." One by one, others rose. Mr. Thompson, the greengrocer, spoke briefly of his own failure to support the original petition. Mrs. Pemberton acknowledged that she had known of the family's difficulty and done nothing to assist. Even Mr. Rowe, though he said nothing, stood with the others, his stance suggesting acceptance, if not quite confession. Mr. Price, observing from his modest position toward the rear of the church, felt tears prick unexpectedly at his eyes, not tears of sorrow, precisely, but rather of something approaching gratitude. Gratitude that his faith in the community's capacity for honest self-examination had not been misplaced, that people who had chosen comfort over conscience might yet choose differently when offered the opportunity to do so. Reverend Merton concluded the service with a prayer of thanksgiving for truth acknowledged and a petition for wisdom in acting upon that acknowledgement. As the congregation departed, there was none of the usual immediate dispersal. Instead, small groups formed in the churchyard, conversations emerging that would, Price suspected, continue in various homes and establishments throughout the day and in days to come. Miss Fenwick approached Price as he prepared to depart. "You did this," she said quietly. "No," Price replied with genuine conviction. "The truth did this. I merely gave it opportunity to be heard. The courage required to acknowledge it belonged to others, to Reverend Merton, to Mrs. Harrow, to all those who chose in that moment to remember honestly rather than forget comfortably." "Yet without your persistence," she observed, "that opportunity would not have existed." Price inclined his head in acknowledgement of her point, though he remained convinced that his role had been less that of instigator than of catalyst, less about imposing truth than about creating space in which truth might be voluntarily acknowledged. As he walked home through the cold January afternoon, Price reflected that the mystery he'd set out to investigate had been resolved not through dramatic revelation or confrontational exposure, but through the quieter, more difficult work of inviting conscience to speak and then trusting that it would be heard. The Ashworth family's story had been recovered from deliberate forgetting. The town's failure had been acknowledged. and while acknowledgement could not undo what had been done, it could at least ensure that the lesson learned might prevent similar failures in future. The truth had been allowed a hearing, and in that hearing, Hedgemore had taken its first steps toward becoming the kind of community it had always claimed to be, but had not, until this moment quite managed to achieve. Chapter 10. When the evening was finally laid to rest. Spring arrived in Hedgemore with that tentative optimism which characterises all English seasons, bringing with it the gradual lengthening of days, the cautious emergence of green things from winter-hardened earth, and that general sense of renewal which suggests that the world, having survived another circuit through darkness, has earned the right to hope once more. It was now some months since that January Sunday when Reverend Merton had spoken truths long avoided, and when Mrs. Harrow had risen to acknowledge what had been done and what had been left undone. In the interval, much had quietly transpired. The Ashworth Relief Fund had been established with contributions from nearly every household in the town, its administration entrusted to a committee that included Miss Fenwick, Reverend Merton, and, somewhat to everyone's surprise, Mr. Gilbert Rowe, whose participation was understood to represent a form of restitution, though the word itself was never spoken aloud. The fund's first beneficiary had been a young widow whose husband's death had left her struggling to maintain both household and small business. The assistance provided had been modest in amount but significant in effect, allowing her to weather immediate difficulties without the necessity of departing Hedgemore to seek uncertain opportunities elsewhere. Word of this aid had spread through the town not as gossip, but as quiet confirmation that the community had meant what it professed during that memorable church service. Mr. Leonard Price, observing these developments with satisfaction, found that his role in the affair had gradually diminished to something approaching invisibility. He was acknowledged certainly when acknowledgment was offered, but the general understanding seemed to be that what had occurred was less the work of any individual than the collective action of a community choosing to confront its own history. This suited Price admirably, as he had never sought prominence and remained most comfortable when operating at the periphery of attention rather than at its centre. It was on an April evening when sunset painted the western sky in shades that poets might describe but which prose can only inadequately suggest, that Price received an unexpected visitor at his lodgings above the stationer's shop. The knock upon his door came just as he was preparing to settle with his evening book, and he opened it to find Mrs. Harrow standing in the modest hallway, her expression suggesting a mixture of purpose and uncertainty. "Mr. Price, forgive the intrusion," she said. "I wonder if I might impose upon you for a few moments' conversation?" Price invited her in with all courtesy, hastily clearing a chair of the papers that had accumulated upon it and offering refreshment, which she politely declined. She settled herself with that careful grace which long practice had made automatic, yet Price detected in her manner something less assured than was typical. As though she came not in her capacity as Hedgemore's social authority, but simply as one person seeking another's understanding. "I have come to thank you," she said, once the initial formalities had been concluded. "I should have done so earlier, but I confess I found it difficult to acknowledge that thanks were owed. Pride, I suppose, though I prefer to think of it as dignity. Yet I have come to understand that true dignity lies not in avoiding acknowledgement of error, but in facing it honestly." "You owe me no thanks," Price replied gently. "You displayed courage that morning in church, Mrs. Harrow. That courage was yours, not mine." "Yet without your persistent inquiry," she observed, "the opportunity to display it would not have arisen. You gave all of us, permission to remember what we had chosen to forget. That is no small gift, Mr. Price, whatever you may say about your own role in the matter." She paused, her gaze moving about his modest room with its shelves of books and its atmosphere of careful simplicity. "I have learned something these past months," she continued. "I learned that the respect I worked so diligently to maintain was less secure than the respect I have earned through honest acknowledgement of failure. People speak to me differently now, not with less deference as I feared they might, but with greater warmth, as though in admitting imperfection I became more rather than less worthy of regard. Humanity recognised is humanity honoured, suggested Price quietly. Just so, agreed Mrs. Harrow. And I find, somewhat to my surprise, that I prefer being regarded as human to being regarded as infallible. The burden of maintaining appearances was greater than I realised until it was lifted. She rose, preparing to depart. I wanted you to know that, Mr. Price, and I wanted to tell you that Hedgemore is fortunate to have you, even if we did not fully appreciate that fact until circumstances compelled us to recognise it. After she had gone, Price sat for some time in the gathering darkness, reflecting upon her words and upon the curious journey that had brought them all to this moment. He thought of that Christmas evening at Ashdown House, when Miss Fenwick's seemingly innocent remark had broken a silence carefully maintained for 15 years. He thought of the days that followed, when the town had struggled between its desire to forget and its reluctant acknowledgement that forgetting came at too high a cost. He thought of the various conversations he had undertaken, the archival discoveries he had made, and the gradual accumulation of understanding that had transformed what began as simple curiosity into something approaching moral imperative. Most of all, he thought about the nature of mystery itself, and how easily one might mistake the dramatic for the significant. There had been no villain in this story, no crime in the conventional sense, no revelation that shocked through its wickedness. Yet there had been mystery nonetheless, the mystery of how good people might collectively allow harm to occur. The mystery of how communities might agree to forget what troubled their consciences, and the deeper mystery of how acknowledgement and redemption might be achieved not through punishment but through the patient work of honest remembering. The following Sunday, Price learned that a letter had arrived from Yorkshire, addressed to Mrs. Harrow. It had come from Margaret Ashworth, the widow of Thomas Ashworth, who had died some 3 years previously. Miss Fenwick, who had been present when the letter was opened, shared its contents with Price later that afternoon. Mrs. Ashworth wrote with dignity and without bitterness. She acknowledged the establishment of the relief fund with gratitude and surprise, expressing appreciation not so much for the material gesture as for the acknowledgement it represented. Her family had prospered modestly in Yorkshire, she reported. Her children were grown and settled. The difficulties of 15 years ago had been survived and, in their own way, overcome. Yet she confessed that the memory of Hedgemore had carried a sadness she had never quite been able to dispel. Not anger, but rather sorrow at what had been lost when circumstances forced their departure. The establishment of the fund, she wrote, had lifted that sadness in ways she struggled to articulate. It suggested that Hedgemore had not forgotten them entirely, that their experience had not been dismissed as inconsequential, and that the town they had loved, despite everything, had proven capable of learning from its mistakes. She closed by expressing hope that the fund would serve its intended purpose, helping others avoid the difficulties her family had faced, and by offering her forgiveness, freely given, to all who felt they required it. This letter, when its contents became known, seemed to settle something in Hedgemore's collective conscience. The past had been acknowledged, the present had been amended, and the future held the promise of better conduct informed by the honest memory. The Christmas evening that nobody had mentioned could now be mentioned, not with shame but with the recognition that difficult truths, when finally spoken, lose their power to haunt and become instead teachers of valuable lessons. As summer approached and the days lengthened toward their annual zenith, Mr. Price continued his quiet work at the town archive, cataloguing documents and assisting visitors with his customary modest competence. To those who knew his story, he appeared unchanged by his role in Hedgemore's moral reckoning. To himself, he felt subtly but significantly transformed, carrying within him the knowledge that patient attention to truth, combined with compassionate invitation to acknowledge it, might accomplish more than dramatic confrontation ever could. The mystery had been solved, though not in the manner one might expect from tales of crime and detection. The Christmas evening had been laid to rest, not through forgetting, but through remembering honestly, accepting responsibility collectively, and resolving to act differently when next the opportunity arose to choose between comfort and conscience. And in this quiet resolution, in this gentle restoration of moral clarity achieved through patience rather than force, through invitation rather than accusation, Hedgemore had become at last the kind of community it had always claimed to be, but had not, until this moment, quite managed to embody. The work was never finished, of course, for moral progress requires constant attention and renewed commitment. Yet a beginning had been made, a foundation laid, and on that foundation, Price believed, something enduring might yet be built. The evening drew down over Hedgemore with its customary peace. Lamps were lit in parlour windows, families gathered around their hearths, and somewhere in Yorkshire, an elderly woman who had once called this town home read and reread a letter that told her she had not been forgotten, that her family's suffering had been acknowledged, and that the community which had failed them once had found the courage to admit its failure and resolve to do better. In the gathering darkness, that seemed enough. Not everything one might hope for, perhaps, but sufficient unto the day, and worthy of the patience and care with which it had been achieved. The Christmas evening nobody mentioned had finally peacefully been laid to rest, not in forgetting, but in the kind of remembering that heals rather than wounds, that teaches rather than condemns, and that invites us all to become, through honest self-examination, slightly better than we were, and slightly closer to what we might yet be.